Here are some body landmarks, some terms and what they're referring to that you need to start become familiar with, because these will be being used over and over again. So the sooner that you start familiarizing yourself with them, the better off you're going to be in the long run. Now, just to mention a few, the term frontal, which is referring to the forehead, we see that quite a bit. We see that when we talk about the bone that makes up the forehead, called the frontal bone, or the lobe of the brain that comes up into the forehead region, the frontal lobe of the cerebrum. So you can see these terms can be used over and over. Another term we see quite a bit is the term buccal. We have the term buccinator, which is sometimes called buccinator, but buccinator is what it's normally called, which is a muscle in the cheek area that would help us compress air, like if you were blowing into a trumpet. We see the term oris or oral, A-U-R-E-L, and auricular is also a term that comes from that, which means ear-like. Oris or oral, most of us are familiar with that term. A term mentis or mental actually refers to the chin area. Axillary or axilla is referring to the armpit region. So there we actually have like an axillary artery, axillary vein, blood vessels that run in the armpit area. So that's used often. Another term that's very often used is the term brachial. So when you take somebody's blood pressure, you're actually closing up the brachial artery. When we talk about this muscle that runs through here, it's called the Bicep Brachii. We have a muscle underneath it called the brachialis. So when we see the term brachial, we know it's referring to the upper arm. Another term, and by the way, I'm not going to go over all of these, but I do expect you to start looking at them. And then if you have questions about, exactly where is this or what does it mean, then you can certainly send a request and I'll try to be more specific with it. But just a few more. Carpal, you might have heard of carpal tunnel syndrome. Carpal refers to the bones in the wrist area and the wrist area in general. The phalanges can actually refer to the fingers or the toes. So you can see the digits or the fingers or toes can also be called phalanges. Pollex refers to the thumb, and hallux actually refers to the big toe. Okay, femur or femoral refers to something going on in the upper leg region, whether that's the bone, the femur, or the femoral artery. Different terms, different muscles that use that term. The term pelvic or pelvis, and then we can actually see, a couple of the same terms over here, a different picture, but kind of slightly, pointing to a lot of the same places. Another very common area that we'll see the name a lot is the term acromial, which is basically referring to the top of the shoulder area. We actually have something called an acromion process, and then we even have the acromial end of the clavicle. So again, that's kind of that knot on your shoulder area. Thoracic referring to the chest region. Again, there's brachial, upper arm. Abdominal, the abdomen region. And we see the terms pubic and groin or inguinal. And they're again referring to this general location. Pubic being more of maybe external and groin being more internal. But again, they're usually used in specific contexts when they will use the term pubic or groin. Okay, again, inguinal. Also, maybe you've heard of something called an inguinal hernia, which was where the intestine tends to protrude through muscles in this area. Okay, coxal is referring to the hip region because the hip bones is called the os coxae. And again, those are terms that we'll become more familiar with. So the faster you become familiar with this, the better that you're going to understand this information. Okay, here we see the posterior or the back side, and we see a lot of terms that also are dealing with the posterior. So you can see I've got actually two totally separate pictures here, but they usually are showing pretty much the same terminology. So dorsal or dorsum refers to the back. Maybe you've heard of a dorsal fin on, on some sort of aquatic animal. Of course, the acromial I was talking about earlier, but here it is on the back of on the top of the shoulder area. Deltoid is literally referring to the shoulder. Scapular is referring to things around the scapula. The cervical or cervicus is referring to the neck region, usually the upper neck region. The gluteal is referring to, of course, the buttocks region. The popliteal is referring to behind the knees. Several things use that terminology. Calcaneus refers to the heel, and actually what you would call your Achilles tendon, we call the calcaneal tendon. So again, without me going over every individual, definitely you want to kind of go through and kind of learn what these terms are referring to and where they're pointing, because you're going to see them used over and over. Okay, to locate things, there is some terminology that we use describing something called regions and something called quadrants. Now, if you'll notice, looking at this picture right here, notice this blue kind of crosshairs area is actually divides up into 4 places. 1, 2, 3, 4. We call these quadrants, and we name the quadrants according to their location. Now, we always state left or right from the picture, the patient, or the model's perspective, not necessarily from where you're standing. So this is this person's right, so that makes this quadrant the right upper quadrant. Okay, so that makes this the right lower quadrant, because they're both on the right side, but one's upper, one's lower. Okay, that makes this area here from this quadrant the left upper quadrant, and then makes this area here the left lower quadrant. So the quadrants are pretty easy. Quad means 4, so as long as we understand we're either upper or we're lower, and we're either right or we're left, but right or left is always said from the picture's perspective, not necessarily from where you're sitting or standing. Okay, now the other part that we want to understand on this is the regions, which we literally have, whereas we only had 4 quadrants, we literally have 9 different regions. Now, if you take this regions, it's almost like a tic-tac-toe box. Place the center area over the umbilicus, the belly button region, and then we call the middle area the umbilical region. Well, epi means above and gastric means stomach. So the epigastric region is the top block here in the middle. Hypo means below, and gastric again means stomach, so below the stomach. And this can also be referred to as the pubic region. So we have the epigastric region, the umbilical region, and the hypogastric region. Now notice everything over here starts out with the word right because it's on his right. Everything over here starts out with the word left because it's on his left. Well, let's start down here and on the sides, beside the pubic area is the groin region. So the term for groin is inguinal. So I have the right inguinal region and the left inguinal region. Here I have the right lumbar, because the lumbar is what we name our 5 lowest vertebrae before we get to the sacrum. So we have a right lumbar region, low back, left lumbar region, low back. Then we have hypochondriac. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, well, I thought a hypochondriac was somebody who, every time they hear about a sickness, they think they've got the sickness they heard about. But in this perspective, hypo means below, and chondral refers to the type of cartilage that lines the ribs through here. So we're saying this is the area below the cartilage in this region on the right side. And so this cartilage that kind of lines the rib cage right through here on the left side is the left hypochondriac region. Now, these terms are often used, especially in surgical procedures or other procedures where we're trying to describe where something is. So, for instance, if we were trying to describe where this part of the spleen that we could see, we would say, well, which quadrant is that in? Well, that's the left upper quadrant. And then which region is that in? Well, we would describe the spleen, at least this portion we can see here, It's been in the left upper quadrant and being in the left hypochondriac region. Now, what if it's an organ like the large intestine, the colon, that starts here and then goes up, across, down, and then back into it? Well, obviously it's in more than one region and quadrant. But what if I had a problem? What if I had a problem right in that area right there? How would I describe where the problem in the colon was? Well, first thing I could do, if I were describing that area, I would say, well, that's the right upper quadrant. And since it's right in that area, then that would be in this block. So that would be the left lumbar region. So I can describe, organs or parts of the body that run into different areas, as long as it's somewhere in the abdominal area right here, that I can describe that as being, according to a quadrant and a region. Okay, some terminology that you have to understand. Some of it you're probably already very familiar with, but I'm going to run over it very quickly. But everything on this picture you need to understand. Now, again, going back to right or left, this is her right, this is her left. So it's always from the perspective of your patient, of your picture, of your model, of your specimen. Now, one thing that this picture also shows, both of them, is that she is standing in the anatomical position, meaning she's standing upright with her palms facing forward, because we always determine directional terms from the anatomical position. So anything above is superior, anything below is inferior. Okay, in the human body, both posterior, the back side, and dorsal refer to the same thing, whereas on the front side, anterior, the front, or ventral, which literally means belly side, because her front side is the same side as her belly, then those terms can be used interchangeably, even though they're usually a context of how they're used. Cranial means towards the head region. Caudal means towards the tail region. And we literally have a tailbone, so that's a correct term. But probably the terms that you'll see the most, and if you understand them, it'll make sense why they're used, is the term proximal versus distal. Proximal means it's closer to the trunk of the body, and distal means it's further away. Now, these can be relative terms. If I compare the fingers to the shoulder, the fingers would definitely be distal, the shoulder would be proximal. But if I were to compare the elbow to the fingers would still be distal, the elbow would be proximal. But if I were to compare the elbow to the shoulder, then the elbow would be distal and the shoulder would be proximal. So whatever's closest to the trunk of the body is more proximal, whatever's furthest away is more distal. Now, so again, you can see the hip is more proximal to the trunk, the feet are more distal. But the knee, if I compared the knee to the foot, the knee would be more proximal, the foot would be more distal. If I compared the knee to the hip, the knee would be more distal and the hip would be more proximal. Now, last but certainly not least, the term medial means if I draw a midline through the body, whatever's closest to the midline is more medial. So it'd be on this side from there to here, this is more medial. But I could have started out here to here, and again, anything pointing towards your midline is more medial, whereas whatever's away from the midline of the body is more lateral. So the shoulders are more lateral than the umbilicus. The umbilicus is more medial. When we talk about, for instance, muscles around the eye, we have some muscles more on the outside of the eye that are called lateral rectus. We have some muscles more on the inside of the eye that are called medial rectus. And again, if we understand medial means towards the midline, lateral means further away, that makes more sense. Our body has space inside of it called a cavity or a coelom. We have in the front of our body what's called the ventral body cavity. We have in the back of the body what's called the dorsal body cavity. The ventral body cavity is divided up into two parts. The thoracic cavity, again, this part above our diaphragm where our lungs and heart is. Below the diaphragm, we have the abdominopelvic cavity, the top part being the abdominal, the bottom part being the pelvic. Then in our dorsal body cavity, it's divided into the cranial cavity, which is where our brain is, and the spinal cavity, which is where our spinal cord runs and is surrounded by the vertebrae.